Okay, evening all. Hope we're doing well. This one comes a couple of days late, but I wanted to share an update on my experience on ADHD medication. Now, 2 weeks into taking a drug known as Elvanse in the UK, Vyvanse in the US, both brand names for the compound Lisdexamfetamine, used to treat what I have and was recently diagnosed with, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. For those unaware, I shared a video about a week ago with my 1 week experience on the drug, and I made 5 observations as to the changes I'd noticed and the impact that was starting to have. So I thought it'd be useful today to share a bit of an evolution of that. I've brought again 5 observations from certainly the last week, but actually the last 2 weeks overall. And what I've seen is an evolution in some of the same changes that I noticed a week ago. And indeed, I've tested out in a couple of new scenarios my kind of behaviour, feelings and internal environment in different situations over the last week. So I thought it'd be good to share an update on that. So just as a summary, the 5 impacts I'm going to be talking about are, number 1, as I mentioned last time, the stringing together of great days, and those days in many ways becoming greater. Number 2, I've noticed some positive social changes, both at work, at home, and in other social situations. I've noticed a definite change in emotional range as number 3, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail in a second. There's been number 4, again, a more evolution in controlling my ability to focus with the benefit of these drugs. And then number 5, like last time, I'm going to share a couple of the side effects that I've noticed more in the last week, sharing a little bit about maybe their impact, how I'm mitigating them, and some of the things that I'm certainly aware of for the future. So let's jump into that. Number 1, over the last week, maybe compared to the first, I've noticed yet more stringing together of what I would call great days. Now, when I say great days, that's only something that I would define for me in the way that I would define it. It usually means achieving what I want to achieve through a few different lenses, whether that's work, fitness, friendship, fun, and the overall sense of peace that I'm aiming for in adult life. Pretty much over the last 2 weeks, I've strung together consistently great days in that regard. And I put that down to a couple of things. Number 1, being able to execute more efficiently with less friction on the things that I know that I need to do, and having maybe as part of that a bit more intrinsic motivation to do the things that I want to do as well. And I'm seeing the reward of that as well. This last week compared to the first, I think I would describe an increased sense of being in flow as I move from activity to activity, task to task, situation to situation throughout the day, which has been nice. There's been less distracting internal chatter. There's been an overall increase in my what feels like energy and endurance for the day, particularly when combining work, fitness, a social life as well. And certainly I've noticed as part of that less frustration throughout the day, less frustrated, a sense that I'm not doing the things that I need or want to do, or that I'm being tired out or exhausted by them in the way that perhaps I would have been only a few weeks ago. There's definitely been, as part of that, less overall anxiety, both in preparing for and starting busy, challenging days, and certainly finishing the day knowing that I've done everything that I need to do has reduced my overall level of anxiety and angst to make me feel altogether a bit more at peace. So for this last week, more great days being strung together, and indeed those days are in many ways getting greater, which is for me really positive and really important. So the second impact I want to talk about, and this is one that I've noticed more in the last week than the first, is what I'd refer to as a raft of social changes and changes in the way that I'm interacting and perhaps behaving with colleagues, with friends, with family. Now, none of these things I think are intrinsically positive or negative. They're just interesting changes I've noticed, naturally, that some have noticed in me as well, which I'm aware of and I also want to be aware of. So starting with the general themes, not least because of an enhanced ability to focus with less mental chatter and a bit more outward focus, I've certainly been more present with my friends and with my colleagues. I've been more present in meetings at work. I've been more present in conversations and able to really listen intently and actively, and to listen closely without having the typical ADHD internal monologue whirring away in the background, trying to work out what I'm going to say next, whilst also trying to pay attention to eye contact, whilst also trying to listen. That's been a much more seamless process. I have been, and others have commented, a lot calmer, I think, in day-to-day interactions and conversations. I'm probably a little bit less reactive, positively or negatively, to the things that people say or the way that they say them. And overall, I'm a bit more level, I would say, in basic conversation. Maybe on, if not the negative side, but one thing I'm very aware of is that calmness and presence that I've probably brought to social interaction over the last week has left me probably coming across at times a little bit subdued. I've noticed this particularly in the evenings, particularly after a busy and pretty productive day, and particularly when moving from, say, a work setting to a social setting. I've probably gone from coming across, very energetic and often perhaps a little bit center of attention, to being a little bit more reserved, and some would say, calm to the point of subdued. Again, I don't think that's a bad thing in itself. I've just generally felt more comfortable in taking that back seat in social situations. But I must admit, it was interesting. I went to a Halloween party last week. I'm not drinking at the moment, partly because of the medications, which probably had an impact. But in a scenario or an environment in which I'd often be very energetic, very sensation-seeking, quite dopaminergic, I actually had a very relaxed evening of kind of sitting back, as it were, from the group, conversing with friends and kind of getting involved in the conversation, but more when it came to me rather than me reaching out and getting it, which is frankly unusual for me. I'll be keeping an eye on this one. I'm aware that probably there are going to be some outward behaviour changes, but I wouldn't want them to be, at least in my case, full-blown personality changes. So just something that I've noticed on the social side over these last 7 days. Cool. So the third thing I've noticed, and this is one, again, that's been for me something that's been more pronounced over the last week, but also has been probably something that I've only really just come to understand and internalise of this experience over the last 2 weeks. And it's what I would describe as having a slightly reduced and perhaps even smoother emotional range. So what do I mean by that? So if you imagine a kind of chart with on the y-axis mood, so 0, +5, -5. On the x-axis, time, perhaps over a day or a week or over an event. A lot of my experience of emotion, positive and negative, has probably been at the extremes as you've gone through the day. So if you've got that graph, I would go from being in states of very high motivation and focus and arousal and interest and maybe even joy, to then descending well below kind of supposed baseline into more negative, anxious, neurotic, or maybe even hopeless feelings. And that could happen sometimes on a daily basis, sometimes on a weekly basis, and sometimes over a slightly longer period than that. As much as I've used that to my advantage, I would say, over my life, in my view, it's never really been a particularly sustainable way to feel. And for better or worse, I've certainly noticed that range, rather than being as kind of spiky over time, hasn't gotten quite as high, but hasn't gotten quite as low, and is certainly more predictable and controllable as well. For me, it's something I'm mindful of. What I don't want to do is be in a place where I become kind of middle of the road and tonic in the way that I feel. Not that has been the case, but again, something I'm just aware of as I'm charting this territory over the next few weeks. Now, in terms of why that is, I think it comes down probably to a few different things. Number one, just by virtue of probably being on this medication and getting treatment for my ADHD, I've become less sensation seeking in the first place externally. I've been more able to control a stable internal emotional environment, being more emotionally regulated, probably in both directions, which I think will be a benefit. Certainly, I've been able to move out of negative frames of mind and low mood states more easily and more proactively over these last couple of weeks. And perhaps I've even deliberately tried to manage the sensation of being on a high as well, knowing full well that I want this to be a sustainable experience for me. So emotional range, look at it this way, it's gone from being a little bit spiky to a much shallower, smoother waveform over the last week, which I'm learning to control, I'm learning to influence, and no doubt there are going to be some environmental and structural changes that I want to make over time to manage that perhaps new emotional range. So that's number 3, emotional range has been a big one. And then finally, in terms of the neutral or positive impacts that I've seen from the medication so far, I want to expand on my point that I made last time around the ability to focus, which is so fundamental to what we're doing here and why we're treating ADHD in the first place. I expressed on my last video that I'd noticed, yes, an increased ability to focus, but more because of the increased ability to ignore. I was still being distracted momentarily by external stimuli, whether that's people walking past my desk in the office or whether it's noises outside, people on the street, whatever it might be. But I was able to remove my attention from that distraction very quickly and refocus back on the task that I was focused on at the time. And what I expressed at the end of that was that I'd noticed, as I'd predicted, that these medications don't so much give you completely indistractable focus whenever you want it, but rather they give you a tool by which you can start to learn to apply your focus in the way and to the things that you want to at the time. A fantastic analogy I heard from this when I was researching the condition a few months ago was seeing one's attention as a spotlight that illuminates things in a relatively narrow range. A healthy attention spotlight, if you like, is one whereby it can be moved and focused on the thing that you want to focus on, and that it can change in terms of its aperture and its intensity. So you can choose to focus on a slightly broader aperture, visually, auditorily, or whatever, try and take in more stimulus, or you can choose to narrow that aperture to be very, very specific onto one thing at one time. And you have a reasonable ability to maintain that level of focus and keep it controlled in spite of environmental distractions. My personal ADHD experience was that spotlight was particularly strong and very, very functional, but that I had no real control as to where it was pointed and with what degree of intensity at any one time. I think it's a learning process, but certainly I think these medications have given me that ability to control the spotlight, and it's something that I'm increasingly learning how to do as well. One of the side effects I've noticed of that is that sometimes when I have pointed my proverbial spotlight at one thing, it's not necessarily always the right thing, and there can be a temptation to hyper-focus on things that are actually, although now intrinsically interesting for some reason, still at the time probably not optimal to the point of being useless. A good example being, as is I think common in ADHD, medicated or otherwise, deciding that a spreadsheet at work, or that a particular corner of the kitchen here, for example, had to be made absolutely perfect, notwithstanding the fact that I had 15 other things to do at work that probably would have been a little bit more productive at the time than what I was looking at. So that was one thing I've noticed. I'm still learning to create focus and to break focus at the appropriate times. And then finally, on the subject of focus, ignorability is the word that I used in my last description, the increased ability to ignore. This has certainly remained over this last week. I've become very, very good at ignoring things, but that actually can become missing things as well. I think it's common in the ADHD experience that we are generally quite good at taking in lots of information from our environment at any one time and seeing patterns that frankly neurotypical brains don't. It's an unusual experience now to be able to deliberately narrow the things entering consciousness from the outside world, but actually it can mean that we miss some of the things that otherwise we would want to pick up on as well. So my encouragement to myself and to anyone who's had a similar experience is with great power comes great responsibility. With the treatment of ADHD, you have an increased ability to focus and an increased ability to ignore. Choose carefully when you want to focus on something to the exclusion of everything else in the moment, but equally choose when you want to be in a state where you're more receptive to more of the external stimuli and information around you as well. Don't be afraid to reduce the proverbial focus on the lens of your mind and let more information come from a wider aperture, perhaps in less high definition at the times that suit you as well, in a very mindful way. That's been what I've been practicing, and I would say it's been pretty helpful so far. And then finally, guys, observation number 5 for this last week. Some in common with the first week, others I've noticed probably more pronouncedly, and I'd like to just maybe talk through them briefly. So, number 1, predictable side effect with ADHD medication is a loss of appetite and some weight loss. I have had both of those things. I have mitigated that with different food choices, eating more in the morning, more liquid calories, etc. I've still dropped a couple of kilos over these last couple of weeks, which I'm not against personally. But if I was in a stage where I was at a lighter body weight or I was trying to avoid weight loss, I would certainly be mindful of that. I'd encourage anyone considering these medications, as your psychiatrist, as your pharmacist, should have expressed, be mindful of that as you go. Another side effect very common to any stimulant medication is an increase in heart rate and increase in blood pressure. I've noticed both of these things. They are still within healthy and completely reasonable ranges. My resting heart rate has gone from an average of about 52 or so, mine's reasonably low, to an average of around 60 to 64. That is resting heart rate taken in the mornings. But I have noticed that when on the medication, certainly in its effective peak, which seems to be about 6 or so hours after ingestion, my quote unquote resting heart rate, resting insofar as I'm still working and moving and things, certainly elevated. It's up in the 80s and 90s sometimes, which is quite unusual for me. Blood pressure, similar story. I was 120 over 77. I'm now about 128 over 82 in terms of average readings, which again is perfectly reasonable. But then there is a big caveat here. I like the gym. I like to exercise. I pick up heavy things, put them down again, and I run long distances relatively frequently. I've noticed that my heart rate in particular for what was a casual effort before is now just higher and stays higher. So if I go on the treadmill, for example, and I'm running at a pace that would have put me at a 125 heart rate or so a few weeks ago, that's now more like a 135 to 138. And I haven't gotten less fit in that time, at least as far as I'm aware. Equally, when lifting weights, particularly when doing sort of relatively heavy compound movements, I've certainly felt subjectively an increase in blood pressure as well, particularly when bracing under load. That's resulted in a little bit of pressure in the head, a couple of headaches as well over time, which again I'm mindful of, particularly as we play around with dosage over this 12-week titration period. At least for me, we'll be keeping a very close eye on these metrics, but something again that I've noticed personally that I would be aware of if you're into your training as well and considering these medications. And then probably the last one for me in terms of side effects, and this one is again a very subjective sense, but certainly from day 1 to about day 10 on these new medications, I was ruthlessly productive, at least by my own standards. I mean, I was doing a lot. I was training every day, if not twice a day. I was working longer hours with more focus. I was spending more time doing things like this in terms of recording my thoughts and writing scripts and ideas. I was doing more around the house and more socially as well with this newfound appetite for getting things done. There is a risk in doing that, particularly when, you know, at the same time you're maybe not eating as much as usual, and certainly my sleep has been a little bit disturbed. I certainly started to feel physically tired, let's say. Burnt out wouldn't be the right word at all, but certainly physically tired at about the 2-week mark or so. So for me, one thing I'm mindful of from my own experience is just managing the risk of doing a lot and making sure that this experience of ADHD treatment is not a sprint, nor is life post-ADHD as opposed to pre-ADHD, but it is a marathon, and I'm looking to manage a sustainable course for the future. So for me, as I'd recommend for all of you, maybe considering or starting these medications, be considerate of the same and continue to be kind to yourself, manage your energy, manage your rest, and ensure you've achieved a level of balance in your day-to-day life that allows you to live happily and sustainably, which is good advice for life in general, right? So guys, that is it for me for week 2. As I say, 5 new or evolved observations, changing together more great days. The days are getting greater. I am noticing some social changes, a bit calmer, a bit more reserved, perhaps to the point of being subdued. I'm mindful of that. I have noticed an decreased emotional range in terms of the peaks and troughs of everyday life and one's internal experience. I have certainly improved my ability to control the spotlight of focus, which I really had experienced as a deliberate process. And then finally, there have been a few side effects related to appetite, related to heart rate, blood pressure and training impact, and a little bit of physical fatigue creeping in from a productive couple of weeks. Guys, any questions you've got, please do let me know. Always very keen to hear about everyone's experience in their journey with ADHD, from consideration to diagnosis to treatment and thereon. Look after yourselves. As always, do look after each other. I will share probably another update in maybe about 2 weeks or so at the 1 month mark. But in the meantime, thanks for listening in, and I'll look forward to the next conversation.